My name is Stan Kimmer, and I am a member of the Community Engagement Committee. And one of the things that we do is we arrange and look for excellent pre-show speakers. Also, just kind of a shameless plug, toward the back of your program book at the play, you can check out my full-page ad right next to Capri. I am a diversity consultant and trainer. Been doing that for about 8 years after retiring from full-time work at IBM. But in terms of introducing tonight's speaker, Vanessa Woods, I belong to an organization where we have a monthly dinner speaker, and we've been doing it for 12 years, and I've been at almost every meeting. So I've heard like 120 speakers at this meeting, and Vanessa is the one that I remember the most and had the biggest impact on me. Of all 120 speakers, you were my favorite. So, you know, I was so impressed. I'm so glad that we got to have her here. She is a New York Times best-selling author, and she's a researcher and a journalist, multi-talented. And she's also bilingual. She does research on chimps and research on dogs. So, you know, she has multiple animals in her life. She also is a writer of children's books. Her main profession is that she's actually a research scientist at Duke University. She's been there since 2005, and she's been going back and forth doing a lot of work in the Democratic Republic of Congo, studying the bonobo chimpanzees. And she's interested in comparing the cognition of the bonobos and the chimpanzees and learning what we can learn from bonobos and how they interact, what they can tell us about becoming a better society. So please join me in welcoming Vanessa Woods.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stan. Stan and I have had lots of email exchanges about when he's going to come to Congo. We're going to drag him over to see Bonobo because he's frequently in Kenya. And I guess I would like to talk about human nature, because we all have theories about human nature, and it's directly relevant to this play. So whether or not we realize it, we all sort of have these theories about how it is that we work, how our psychology works. So, for instance, theories about, you know, whether some people are smart or naturally sort of less smart than other people informs how we educate our children. Theories about whether some people are inherently better behaved than others will influence who we incarcerate for how long. And there is no theory of human nature that is more powerful than evolution. Because evolution is about who we are and how we came to be here, and also those changes over time. Not just the way our bodies changed, but also our psychology and how our psychology has changed over time. So I think this play is super interesting because it is often pitted as science versus religion. And it's not really the case. And I'm not sure how many of you know the play, but one of the main characters is Henry Drummond, and he was sort of portrayed as this kind of like Bible-bashing zealot who was just strongly opposed to this kind of this new or upcoming idea of evolution that was being taught in schools. But actually that's not the case at all, and it was much more nuanced than that, and the nuances are directly relevant to all sorts of issues that we're seeing in society today. So the theory of evolution that he was dealing with was very specific, and I guess no sort of evolution as a theory is subject to all the human sort of errors and you know, biases that, you know, we generally have as people. So I mean the theory is solid, and I think one of the most incredible things is that Charles Darwin, and you resemble him very much. I swear. And let me just tell you,
old enough to be.
let me tell you this: Charles Darwin was a sexy man. He really was. Not just inside. I mean, just the sheer power of his intellect was just incredible. Before we had genetics, before there was social science, before there was any real study of psychology, Chucky D, as we like to call him, in Evolutionary Anthropology, he just got so many things right. And I mean, he was a genius in the sense that he just wrote so much stuff, like without a computer, without even a typewriter. I mean, writing with those quill pens, kind of like trying to type a tweet. Like, and he just wrote these prodigious volumes of things, and so many things that we found in the evidence and the sciences that have come subsequently show that he was just spot on so many things. And I think that I don't know whether it's coincidence or not, but because his volumes were, and I mean, you know, I'm in the Department of Evolutionary Anthropology at Duke. I don't think anyone's read everything that Charles Darwin has written. I mean, it's just overwhelming. It's volumes and volumes, you know, into the Beagle and this and there. I mean, it's just never ending. You could probably fill this room with papers that Charles Darwin has written. And so, as usually happens, is you usually get the crib notes, the sort of the diluted version of Darwin. And I guess if we were going to compare the brand of evolution as it is, it would be kind of like the food lion of the scientists, of the sciences. Like, you know, you've got neuroscience, it's the whole foods. Only a certain amount of people seem to go there. Psychology would be like Paris Teeter. Everybody sort of, you know, goes in there sort of like open to everyone. Yeah, evolutionary anthropology is a very daggy science. As a matter of fact, if I want to kill a conversation really quickly and someone asks what I do, I'm like, oh, I'm in evolutionary anthropology. That's nice. And so as a brand, it's sort of struggled because it's sort of very complicated. And in the same year that this play was out, there was an article in Time Life magazine about trying to explain the theory of evolution and specifically human evolution and how we got to be where we are. And it really did a great job. It showed kind of like the difference between the fact that there were different human species, that evolution is not a nice linear line, it's kind of like this tangled bush. About 50,000 years ago, there were actually at least four other human species that we knew of, and we were really not really the clear winners of it all. My friend Herman likes to say that we were the Mexican hairless dogs. I'm sure if you're familiar with that. But, you know, if you were looking at the way it was 50,000 years ago, I mean, we weren't even really a clear winner. There's sort of this idea that, you know, as soon as modern humans came out onto the scene, then we just took over everything, and then we got all this technology, and then it was just like win, win, win all the way. But in reality, like a lot of these other humans who were around, they probably look like a better bet, especially the Neanderthals. And if I was to sort of encapsulate the quintessential Neanderthal, it would be Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter. May he rest in peace. President Steve Irwin. Yeah, you know, big, barrel-chested, super muscular, really unafraid of large, dangerous animals. And I mean, Neanderthals, they were kind of like the best human there was around. And as a matter of fact, when we kind of like sort of arrived in Europe with our really super slender bodies, we weren't really adapted for cold, we just didn't do very well. And as a matter of fact, we tried to go into Europe, but when the oncoming glacials started to come down, we just ran back to where it was warmer. So the point is that there are lots of these different humans around, and this article did a great job of explaining that. But they had one thing, if you're going to talk about branding, so in terms of evolutionary anthropology, there was this graphic, this one graphic, and it was like an ape slowly standing up to be, everybody knows it, right? One thing that everyone knows about evolutionary anthropology, and that's it. It was like, it was so powerful and so clear, and completely wrong. It's like evolution is not a nice linear progression from apes, because it's sort of the inference is that, kind of like sea sponges at the bottom, and you're slowly like developing towards this pinnacle of human perfection. That's not what evolution is at all. It's like this messy, tangled bush, and it kind of you go forward and then you go backwards, and things evolve things congruently, like eyes and wings evolve many times. But this graphic was so powerful and so overwhelming, it literally became the logo of evolutionary anthropology. I mean, there are sort of, the Leakey Foundation uses it as their logo. And then, so if you're talking about the branding, so you've got the logo, and then the tagline ended up survival of the fittest. And of all Darwin's writings, just prodigious volumes of it, that one little sentence is all anybody knows. Can anybody quote anything out of Darwin besides that? Right. Right. So when you have that, you've got evolutionary anthropology, you've got the logo of this, and then you've got the survival of the fittest. You have, because of the way our psychology works, you have this perfect storm for the idea that humans are better than various other animals that look less and less like us. And then that really segues nicely into some groups of people are better. And this kind of idea of survival of the fittest, and let me go back to that for a minute, because somewhere along the way, fitness got confused with physical fitness. That was not what Darwin meant at all. Survival of the, fitness to Darwin was not when you went and did an Orange Theory. It was not a workout. It was about your reproduction and how good you were at passing on your genes to the next generation. So when you have that sort of like linear evolution, and then you have something like survival of the fittest, which is this idea that the strongest and the most ruthless are going to dominate the kind of the world, then you have this melting, you have this crucible for the idea that some people are better than others, and that the strongest and the most ruthless will survive. And so Henry Drummond, who was the main character, he was not this kind of like Bible-bashing conservative. He was actually really progressive in a lot of the ways. He fought for women's rights. And then, this idea of evolution that was being touted at the time was incredibly, it was just like everything against what the church was teaching, that the meek should inherit the earth, that you should be kind to all fellow creatures. And this concept of evolution, and he was right to be trepidatious about this, because this concept of evolution, as it crystallized, just went so far in doing so much damage. And just for example, Nazi biologists really loved this concept of Darwin. They called it social Darwinism. So they really took that, they embraced it, the idea that some groups of people were less evolved than others. It was complicated. They used this idea of domestication, like selective breeding, because once you start talking about certain traits that are desirable in people, then you can start looking at how to breed them out. And I think another confusing part of Darwin's work was that he actually used domestication to illustrate how evolution might work, because in Victorian England, breeding was like a huge thing. People were like super crazy about breeding dogs, pigeons, like all sorts of things. They had these fanciers, and don't forget that Victorian England was super classist. Like you had, it was all about breeding and old money, and there was no moving up through the ladder that existed. Of course, the poor people on the bottom, the rich were on the top. And so this idea that you could take traits that they were so familiar, they were really familiar with getting the kind of dog that you wanted, or the kind of pigeon that you wanted, and so the idea quickly spread that you could get the kind of person that you wanted. So if you were talking, it all started like it always does with mental and physical disabilities. So, sucks not to have any legs, really terrible to be blind, like wouldn't it be great if we could somehow weed that out of the population? And then you start on this really super slippery slope of other traits you would like. Wouldn't it be great to have, people who are more intelligent, people who were, taller, stronger, had a certain look? And then the problem always becomes that who are the people in charge, especially when this becomes institutionalized, who are the people in charge of making those decisions about what is a desirable trait and what is not? So from the mental and physical disabilities, it always usually goes to criminals, because that population is undesirable, and then you move through ideas of born criminality, inherited criminality, that some people are more prone to become criminals than others, and so then you sort of go back to this idea that, well, who is it that we incarcerate and for how long? And then from the criminals you always end up at the poor. And what is it about, the poor that you would like to weed out? Is it the way they look? Is it some kind of culture that they have? And so, is everybody familiar with eugenics?
Yes.
So this is basically where eugenics came from, this idea that there was a linear form of evolution, and that survival of the fittest was the tagline, and this was the way forward. And so we all know where Nazi Germany ended up, but I think what is less known is where the Nazis got this idea from. And so it started in Victorian England. It went really badly in Nazi Germany, but the Nazis actually learned from American scientists, and actually they all went California. Californians, anyone from California here? They think they're so progressive, but they did. They actually had the largest eugenics program anywhere in America. And by eugenics, I mean that when you start looking at selective breeding, then you're going to talk about preventing certain types of people from getting together, and that's why you get into sterilization. And not many people know this, but Nazi Germany, that's what they first did. They started with the prevention of life before they went to the ending of life. So they sterilized so many German women, so many. It was just in the hundreds of thousands. And they would clock them in, and they would send them in, they were sterilizing them. But the procedure they learned on how to sterilize and vasectomize was here. They got them from American doctors. And America had already had a widespread sterilization program. And this, and it wasn't just America, to be fair. It spread all over the world, Japan, Switzerland, like all these really places that we think of being really progressive had eugenics sterilization programs. But after World War II, and people had kind of realized what had happened, everybody took a step back and decided that maybe this wasn't such a great idea. Except for America. America kept going. As a matter of fact, some eugenics programs expanded. And the last forcible eugenics sterilization was in Ohio in 1981. And actually North Carolina was also particularly bad for this, especially towards minority women. Because once you go from like mental or physical disabilities, then you started getting into this idea of feeble-mindedness, and the big threat to to those in power and control was this idea. The thing they were most afraid of was not the obvious physical and mental disabilities. It was that people who seemed normal and functional, but would then pass on their, what they call degeneracy and feeble-mindedness to the next generation, and this fear that they were breeding like rabbits. And so in order to collect Social Security, women had to be sterilized. In order to send their kids to free public schools, if they were below a certain income, they were sterilized. This was just really long and far-reaching. So this play was written in the 1950s about something that happened in 1925, but it was so prescient because everything since then has just gone on a trajectory that no one's really been paying attention to. And the sort of the sterilization program in America died out very quietly. It's not taught. I mean, everybody knows about the Nazi genocide, but nobody knows about what happened in America. Nobody knows that the Nazi genocide was learned from America, and that they did go the one step further. They started preventing, like they started ending life from preventing life. But it is this just very hush-hush part of our education and the culture. And so that's, I think, why I was so excited to come and be a part of this, is because this play and the bringing of the arts to people like this is a way of reminding us what has happened. And that's not a, it's not sort of through any formal education, but this is the only really access we have to this illuminating lesson that we all need to learn. And so, yes, question?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's a wonderful presentation you made. I'm sure we all understand exactly where you're going with this, and it's incredible that we're able to witness what we're going to do in a few minutes. I just was on a trip along the Danube, and I saw what they did in Europe. Europe just basically had incredible genocide. And you see the concentration camps, you see what happened there, you see the lack of willingness to negotiate and compromise. You come back to America. America has a lot going for it, and I agree everything you're saying, but we're doing something that's not being done in the rest of the world.
So I would like to say that yes, and I am an American despite my accent, and I can tell you
I
lots
didn't
of
mean
patriotic.
otherwise, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right, and I can say lots of patriotic things, but I will say this, is that genocide is not particular to one particular culture, and actually there's been genocide on every single continent in the last 200 years, except for Antarctica, and that includes America, if you are going to look at the Native American genocide. I think that it depends on how you define genocide, but there was genocide in Australia, when I'm from. There's genocide, of course, all over Europe, there's genocide all over Africa. I would say that when you're talking about human nature, this is one of the things that we are all capable of. And I think it is the duty of culture to deal with that and move forward. And I think that America's done a really wonderful job. I think it's incredibly progressive in some ways, but I think the denial of human nature, and this is something that we are all capable of, is incredibly dangerous. And I think that the recent political events took everyone by surprise because we thought that, again, that culture is almost like that linear version, the linear logo that we see is that culture is always forward. And that in the post-civil rights era, everybody declared, including a lot of academics in social science, that racism was dead. And now we're dealing with kind of like a new racism, a subtle racism, covert racism. And I would say that's not true at all. I think we're dealing with absolute blatant racism. And I could go into that because, and just, I don't want to talk for too long to distract from the play, but just one example of that is something called Simian Ization. And Simian Ization is where you compare people, a group of people, to apes or monkeys. And this is a very new area of research, and it came as such a shock to me because I've spent the last 15 years trying to humanize great apes. So I would talk about how human bonobos are and how wonderful and amazing and incredible, and yes, they're just like us, exactly like us. They do all the same things, except for they're just a little bit better. And so it was a shock to me. It was a shock to me to find out that Simian Ization was a form of dehumanization that was so destructive. And there are a lot of groups that have been Simianized over the years. The Jewish people were Simianized during World War II. Post-World War II was the Japanese and Chinese were shown with like sort of monkey-like faces. But it is African Americans. And that is really a Simianization that has been really sticky. And if you look and question the Scopes monkey trials, I mean, the thing that they were struggling with was this descent from the great apes. And in some ways it's like, and I, for a long time, didn't get it. It's like, wow, great apes are so awesome. Like, they're bigger, they're stronger. I mean, I love them because I love bonobos. They grew up with me. They're, part of my heart. And so for me, this is just not, this was not anything that I would ever have been ashamed or struggled with until you think about what's called the Uncanny Valley. So in the 1970s, the roboticist Maury came up with this theory about robots, because in the 70s, like, everybody was thinking of AI and they were all going to be taken over by robots. And so his theory was that the closer a robot became towards human, like the more human-like a robot became, the more we would like them, until they became almost too human. And then that sort of like, and then we would feel this sort of like almost involuntary revulsion and disgust. So you think of like, like a mannequin or like a robot that suddenly like moves really suddenly, like, Blade Runner, like some of those movements were just really kind of uncanny, and he called this the Uncanny Valley. And it was this point at which you were almost human but not quite, that just really evoked this kind of almost involuntary disgust. And so I think that's where a lot of this resistance to our relationship with great apes, where it comes from. And I think that is why the Simian Ization of various groups of people has been so damaging. Because when you think about it, like when you dehumanize people, it's usually rats, like you call people rats or dogs in certain cultures, and animals that, you know, bacteria, microbes, and you can see this even now with political leaders, like all over the world. But they're, you know, cockroaches, it was cockroaches in Rwanda, but great apes, but these are all sort of like disgusting animals, and great apes have been, you know, really portrayed well in the media, but, you know, it is this uncanny valley. So when you hear about, you know, just sort of like the fury about, you know, a small black child wearing a shirt that says the coolest monkey in the jungle, or when Obama was like extensively, and his whole family were extensively compared to like great apes and gorillas. This is a really pernicious form of dehumanization that really leads to real world harm. So Philip Atiba-Goff is a social scientist, and he's done these experiments where when police officers implicitly associate black faces with gorillas, they were more likely to use force or harm a minor, a black minor. So when you hear about, you know, violence towards black children, the overestimation of the ages of black children, then this really sort of comes back to this sort of like association with great apes that I think still exists. And so the monkey trials are actually not really the monkey trials, because Europeans have been familiar with monkeys since, like, you know, the 16th century, but these are like cute little monkeys, you know, capuchin monkeys, Pirates of the Caribbean type monkeys, and they were like dressed up and ridiculed and sort of made fun of. But the great apes arrived in Europe around the same time as the slave trade was really picking up across the transatlantic. I mean, the bodies of great apes arrived in Europe. This was a real shock for people because, you know, a gorilla is not a monkey. It can stand and look you in the eye and throw you across the room, basically. So there was all these kind of like stories of these mythical creatures on the dark African continent, but a lot of them were like, you know, Loch Ness monsters and fire-breathing dragons. When great apes arrived, then this was a real shock to everyone. And again, this kind of like just cemented the idea that the linear progression of evolution, great apes were here, humans were up here, and, you know, because of the Uncanny Valley, perhaps this made white Europeans uncomfortable. So instead of, you know, sort of adhering to the philosophy that Darwin had, which is this kind of like messy bush of evolution, when you start to get this linear ladder, then you can start inserting rungs into that ladder. And so if, you know, great apes were going to be the intermediary between humans and, you know, the rest of all life forms, then black people would be the intermediary between humans and great apes. And so that was the damage that was done in the 18th century, and that has carried on all the way till today. And I think that when I'm watching current affairs and there's this kind of like fury about these things, I think people aren't really internalizing why, which is why this play is so important, because it deals with so many of these things, like, you know, mistaken versions of evolution and how powerful those mistaken versions are, how they ricochet through the generations and impact who we are and how we feel today. And I just have one more thing to say, and is that as humans, I would say that our biggest kryptonite is that we are so cruel to people who we do not see as like us. So with chimpanzees, it's super easy. Like, if that's the line and you live over there, you are my mortal enemy and I'm gonna kill you, you know, take your females. If you're over this side, then, you know, we're friends. I mean, you know, some dust up. Sometimes they kill babies, but, you know, in the nicest possible way, so she'll mate with you and then have your babies. But it's like, it's a line. With humans, that line is so flexible. It is so flexible who we decide is like us and not like us. Sports jerseys, religion, like anything, like they've done these arbitrary expressions. You put an armband, you say some kids have got blue eyes, some kids have got brown eyes, and you immediately see this kind of like knock-on effect that can lead very easily to genocide in the right kind of circumstances. And I think that is our kryptonite. The flip side is we're incredibly kind to people whom we see as like us, to people we see as part of our community, kinder than any other species. We give blood, we donate organs, we go to church together, we help each other, and many people in this room have done wonderful things to those they feel are part of their community and part of their network. And I'll say this about bonobos, is that the one way, if there was going to be a ladder, which there isn't, bonobos will be at the top, because they see all strangers as friends, and that is their gift, is that they do not have this adverse reaction. They welcome strangers, they prefer strangers, they will share food with strangers. They have this incredible response to individuals that they know are not from their group, are not from somewhere they know, somewhere they've never seen before. They are incredibly pro-social. And that is why I think that bonobos are the super best. Any questions? Yes.
Are bonobos jealous?
Jealous as in?
Just with anything, with like material or with friends.
Possessive, yeah. Are they possessive?
I mean,
Yeah.
sure, but the jealousy that would lead King David to kill the wife of, what was her name?
Bathsheba was the wife, the husband Uriah.
No, not that kind of jealousy. Jealousy isn't give me that toy. Jealousy isn't, oh, you had sex with him and not me. But these are all manageable things. It's not jealousy that escalates to extreme violence or lethal violence. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Folks, Vanessa's wonderful book is on sale in the lobby, if you or at the local bookstores or on Amazon.com or whatever. Please, this is my beach read next week. It's fabulous. We are so happy that you're here, and we hope you enjoy the show today. And hopefully this talk, I see new aspects of the show through this wonderful talk, and I directed the show, so it's this is really very important. Thank you so much.
Thank you.